She had no throne, no voice in the palace, no army to command. Just a mother's heart shattered beyond words. Her sons were torn from her, stripped of justice, hung and left to rot beneath the open sky. No burial, no dignity, no closure. But she didn't leave. Through blazing heat by day and the howls of wild beasts at night, she stayed. She took her pain and turned it into presence. She transformed grief into silent, unrelenting protest. For months, she sat on a rock, watching, swatting away vultures, guarding the broken bodies of her boys. Not a word spoken, not a tear wasted. Just her love, louder than any shout. Her name was Rizpah. And though her story is buried in the shadows of Scripture, it changed the heart of a king and brought peace to a nation. This is not just the story of a mother. This is the story of grief becoming strength, of pain transforming into power. This is the untold story of Rizpah. If this story is already stirring something in you, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to see the power of a mother's love. Now, let's begin.
Before the famine, before the executions, before the haunting vigil on the hill, Rizpah was simply a woman in the shadow of a king. She was a concubine of Saul, Israel's first monarch, not a queen, not a wife, a concubine, chosen perhaps for beauty or diplomacy, but without the full recognition of marriage. Her status was precarious, her voice limited, her place in the palace was secure only as long as Saul lived and her sons were of use. And yet, from this fragile space, Rizpah gave birth to two sons, Armoni and Mephibosheth. They were Saul's blood, royal by lineage, but not heirs. They were boys born to a mother with no crown and a father locked in a spiral of rage, rebellion, and ultimately, ruin. Saul's downfall was swift and tragic. Once chosen by God and anointed by the prophet Samuel, he allowed jealousy, pride, and disobedience to corrode his rule. His relentless pursuit of David, his son-in-law and former ally, led to national instability. Battles were lost, morale was shattered, and eventually, Saul's dynasty crumbled. He died by his own sword on Mount Gilboa alongside 3 of his sons. Israel mourned, but mourning quickly turned to movement, and David, the shepherd-turned-warrior, took the throne. And what of Rizpah? She remained. In a kingdom transitioning power, she lingered in the palace's dim corridors with no husband and no promise of protection. Her sons, once symbols of Saul's strength, were now threats to David's security. They were living reminders of the former regime. Still, David didn't kill them, at least not at first. Time passed. Saul's house faded. David's kingdom grew stronger, and with it came peace, prosperity, and then, without warning, famine. A relentless famine struck the land. 1 year passed, then another, and then a third. The people cried out. The crops failed. The sky gave no rain. The king, weary and searching, turned to the Lord for answers. And what he heard was chilling. "This famine," God said, "is because of Saul and his blood-stained house. He broke the covenant with the Gibeonites. The Gibeonites, non-Israelites who had tricked Joshua into a treaty generations earlier, had been granted protection. But Saul, in his zeal, had attacked them. He violated sacred oaths and spilled innocent blood. And though Saul was long gone, his sins still echoed through the land. David summoned the Gibeonites and asked what must be done. They wanted no silver, no gold, only blood. They said, "Give us 7 of Saul's male descendants, so we may hang them before the Lord." And David, desperate to lift the curse and save the nation, agreed. 2 of the men chosen were Rizpah's sons, Armani and Mephibosheth. No trial, no defense, no mercy. They were taken from her, just like that. The king who had spared them now sacrificed them, not because they had sinned, but because their father had. They were symbols, substitutes, offerings. They were led to the hill of execution, hung, exposed, left beneath the scorching sun, their lifeless bodies swinging in silence. No burial rites, no funeral songs, just abandonment. And Rizpah watched it all happen. Her world, once dim, was now soaked in darkness. And yet, she didn't collapse. She rose. And that is where her true story begins.
The wind howled across the hills of Gibeah. The sun blazed down with merciless heat. Birds of prey circled overhead, drawn by the scent of death. Wild animals prowled in the shadows, waiting for the veil of night to fall. And there, beneath the hanging bodies of the executed, sat a woman on a rock. Rizpah, the same woman who had once walked the polished halls of Saul's palace, now sat in sackcloth under the open sky. There was no guard to protect her, no priest to comfort her, no child left to cling to, just her and the dead. She could have turned away. She could have mourned from a distance. She could have begged David for mercy or buried her pain in silence. But Rizpah chose presence over absence. She chose to sit at the feet of grief, not to flee from it. Day after day she guarded the bodies. Armoni, Mephibosheth, and the 5 others who shared their fate. Their corpses hung for weeks, their flesh decaying, the air thick with rot. But Rizpah remained. She brought no sword, no staff, no weapon, only a strip of coarse sackcloth, mourning attire. She spread it across a rock and claimed it as her ground. She stood between her sons and the scavengers. When the vultures dove from the sky, she waved them off. When jackals crept from the forest, she rose and drove them back. Her arms became wings, her voice a cry of defiance. Every morning she opened her eyes to death. Every evening she prepared for battle, not against men, but against nature itself. She fought off beasts, fought off hunger, fought off despair. Weeks passed, then months. From the beginning of the barley harvest to the time when rain finally fell upon the land. It was nearly half a year. And the people saw her, whispered about her, wondered. Some called her mad, others holy, but no one moved to help her. No one dared to remove the bodies. David had ordered the execution, and until he changed his mind, the land would remain cursed, and the dead would remain exposed.
But Rizpah's vigil was not in vain. Her silent defiance spoke louder than any cry. Her endurance became a psalm. Her grief became prophecy. Word of her vigil reached the palace. David heard about the woman who had refused to leave the hill, the woman who had chased away wild beasts with nothing but ragged cloth and motherly love, and something in him broke. He remembered Saul. He remembered Jonathan, his best friend, Saul's son, whose body had been lost to war, but later recovered and buried with honor. He thought of the bones of the kings and the unburied sons swaying in the wind, and he remembered God. He ordered the remains of Saul and Jonathan to be retrieved from Jabesh Gilead, where they had been buried in haste. He gathered the bones of the executed men, and finally, he gave them all a proper burial. It was only then that the famine lifted. Rain returned to the land, crops began to grow, and peace, however fragile, settled once more over Israel. But the truest peace belonged not to the nation, not even to David, but to Rizpah. She had seen it through. She had endured. She had mourned not just with sorrow, but with sacred strength. Her vigil had brought justice. Her grief had birthed change. And though history often forgets her name, heaven surely does not.
Rizpah's vigil ended with a burial, but her legacy had only begun to speak. In the silence of her months-long protest, she had become something more than a grieving mother. She had become a symbol, a voice for the voiceless, a testimony to endurance that even a king could not ignore. Her story, tucked between the conquests of David and the genealogies of kings, is one of the Bible's quietest miracles, not of parted seas or fire from heaven, but of the human soul refusing to be broken. She did not raise her voice in the palace courts. She did not wage war with swords. Yet her presence, weather-worn, tear-soaked, unwavering, reshaped justice in the land. Consider what it meant. At a time when women were rarely remembered by name, when concubines were disposable, and when grief was supposed to be private, Rizpah made her sorrow public. She forced her nation to look at its shame. She forced the king to confront the cost of political atonement. And she did it not with rebellion, but with radical love. In ancient Israel, justice was tied to burial. To die and not be buried was considered a curse, a mark of disgrace. Yet Rizpah refused to let that fate define her sons. Even in death, she fought for their dignity, and in doing so, she redefined what it means to love. How many others passed that hill and looked away? How many soldiers stood guard and said nothing? How many priests, scribes, or elders chose silence while Rizpah sat alone, chasing away the buzzards? And yet she stayed. Rizpah's story whispers to anyone who has ever waited in pain, to every parent who has lost a child, to every soul who has stood vigil over injustice, hoping someone, anyone, would see and act. David did see, and David did act, but not before Rizpah endured. And here lies the power of her story. Her strength was not in what she changed, but in her refusal to surrender to despair. She teaches us that presence can be a protest, that love can be louder than violence, that one woman, seemingly forgotten, can become the conscience of a kingdom. And though the rains eventually fell, quenching the drought, Rizpah's tears had already watered the ground.
We don't know what became of her after the burial. Scripture gives no final word about her fate. But maybe that's the point. Her act was not for recognition. Her vigil was not for fame. It was for her sons, for what was right, for what should have never been denied. The hills of Gibeah are silent now. The bones are buried. The famine has lifted. But Rizpah remains, etched not just in Scripture, but in every heart that knows the pain of loss and the power of love. She is proof that grief can birth justice, that the quietest voices can echo for generations, that strength, real strength, sometimes looks like a mother, sitting on a rock, refusing to leave. Thank you for watching this powerful journey through the life of Rizpah. If her story moved you, please like, subscribe, and share this video. And tell us in the comments, what part of her story touched you the most? Until next time, stay strong, stay faithful, and never underestimate the power of a single act of love.